right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever corner of the world you are. Welcome to ICS Cybersecurity Day. I'm Lucian Fogoros. I'm the co-founder of IoT World. And on behalf of my team, our sponsors, our speakers, thank you for joining. Thanks for taking the time. There's roughly about 4,000 people sign up throughout the day. And would like to thank you for choosing to learn about ICS Cybersecurity Day. So I'm dialing in from San Francisco. I'm actually at the conference. And to paraphrase one of the former FBI operative, Mr. O'Neill, he has indicated that if cybercrime would be a GDP of a country, it would be the third largest economy in the world. So with that in mind, I'm hoping that you'd be as interactive as you can. I would like to welcome Julia Pitlik, who will be introducing our keynote speaker. Thank you, the sponsor of this session, Verve, for this, and appreciate the opportunity. So make sure you leverage the chat. Tell us where you're at from, and the Q&A is where the official questions. So welcome, Julia.
Great. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today as we kick off IIoT World ICS Cybersecurity Day 2023. This session today will run approximately 59 minutes, and that includes time that we've allotted for questions at the conclusion of the presentation. If you'd like to propose a question, we ask that you please post it in the Q&A tool. Also, I want to take the time today to acknowledge this session's sponsor, which is Verve Industrial, who we graciously thank for their support and participation. And I'm honored to be here today to guide the discussion as we delve into the very important topic of what you've been missing without risk-based prioritization of OT risks and threats, sponsored by Verve. The convergence of IT, IoT, and OT environments has increased the complexity and also the vulnerability of previously what we would consider isolated OT and ICS networks, and then also newly designed cyber-physical systems, introducing the need for a holistic, automated approach to asset discovery risk assessment to help avoid downtime. According to Gartner, they have an interesting statistic that they shared in one of their recent reports. By 2025, 70% of asset-intensive organizations will actually have converged their security functions across the enterprise and operational environments. So over the next hour, Verve's VP of Solutions, Rick Kaun, will share how you can ensure that your organization gathers deep visibility of risks and makes rapid progress rather than being overwhelmed by the tens of thousands of critical vulnerabilities and risks in your sensitive OT environment. A little background on Rick: he has over 20 years of experience designing and implementing OT security programs, and then also tailoring projects to clients in oil and gas, refining, mining, power and manufacturing, just to name a few. Rick always approaches engagements intending to build a scalable, cost-effective, and manageable solution. So we have a lot to cover today in our short 59 minutes. That's actually probably down to like 57. So Rick, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Excellent job, by the way, Julia. Very well prepared. I hope I do justice to the intro you just gave. As Julia had mentioned, my name is Rick Kaun. We're going to go through a particular topic today, mostly what have you been missing without risk-based prioritization. It's not just what you're missing if you're already doing it, but it's what you will miss if you're just embarking on a program and trying to get started. So I'm going to go through a fair amount of content. Please, as mentioned earlier, throw your questions in the Q&A, and so that we can continue the dialogue beyond simply being a lecture here today. So what we're going to do is there's a QR code to learn more about this session and contact. I see there's already some questions about the slides and whatnot, and my contact information will be at the end as well. So today we're going to be talking about risk-based prioritization. This is a key component in OT, especially based on some of the things that Julie was saying, you know, the convergence of IT and OT, the difference in the fragility of the environments, the different makeup of the equipment in the environment, means that we can't simply use single indicators of compromise. We need to understand the true nature and life cycle of these assets. And that changes the game a little. It's a change that a lot of people don't necessarily anticipate, and then they get sort of caught going back to the drawing board. So today I'm going to talk to a little bit of an introduction. I found a historical observation. It was another speaker at another trade show, and I found a recent article that I think really sums it nicely and frames today's discussion. So I'll jump into that one a little bit. Then I want to frame the actual problem. We need to understand why risk-based is such a big deal by examining the environment we're trying to do it in. And then we have some suggestions of what some of your peers in different industries around the world are doing. And so not just, hyperbole from me, somebody who thinks he has an idea, but actual real world examples. And I even got a case study at the end here to show what the difference can look like. And by the way, we don't just want to do prioritization. The prioritization is leading towards risk reduction, right? Anybody can buy a tool and give me a list of bad things. Like I said, I walked into a plant manager's office once to do an assessment, and he said, "You're here to tell me that I don't patch and I don't change passwords. How does that help me?" And it's a fair observation. We already sort of know that there's a big pile of work to be done over there, but how do we make it make sense, and how do we actually execute against it? As always, there will be Q&A at the end and a summary to sort of sum things up once we get there. So by way of introduction, as you already heard, my name is Rick. I've been in OT security, building, designing, taking care of different content, helping clients build programs, assessing existing infrastructure and whatnot for about 22 years. And in that time, I worked for a small company called Kaun. We got acquired by Honeywell. I was then afforded a global role. So I've seen the aftershock of Shamoon and Saudi Aramco, and we had 37 people come to an OT meeting. We've also seen the small mom and pop pulp and paper mills and the small manufacturing and whatnot around the world. And everybody struggles with the same challenge, unfortunately. Today I work for a company called Verve. It is a vendor neutral company again, although if you've seen the news, you've heard that we were acquired 2 days ago to the global services division of Rockwell Automation, which is great because we can help extend the message to multiple places. But nonetheless, I've been doing it for a while. Verve is a very interesting company. We're going to show you a little bit of the components in it here. And in fact, I have a quick little intro video I'm just going to play for you so you can kind of see if it would play. That's not the one I want. I put a new video up and it's not there, so we'll skip the video. Maybe we'll get it back up at the end. I will come back to that shortly. But let's carry on with the topic. So the historical reference. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of the bullet hole misconception. So the diagram you see on the slide is an image of an actual real story about World War II, I believe it was, where an engineer was trying to work with the various Army and Navy or Air Force generals as to how to better protect the planes that were getting shot down over, as tends to happen in the war. And what had happened was the Army and Air Force generals were looking at the planes in the yard, and they're looking at where the bullet holes were, and they were deciding, well, that's where we need to go ahead and patch things up, because look, this is where all these holes are, and that's bad, and we should probably fix those. But the engineer actually did the opposite, because his theory was the ones that made it back and were safely in their territory were the ones that didn't get shot down. So clearly those bullet holes were sustainable. And so the benefit, and by the way, this is this particular summary is from, you can see I put the link in here. It's an actual PhD candidate, Lady Bia Amaya, you see there. She actually summarized it and then came up with 3 basic conclusions, which are going to drive a little bit of what we talked today. And number 1 is that data is only data. I mean, it's the underlying topic line for what we're talking today, that context is key. Diversity in teams, in other words, viewpoints, perspectives, support, analysis, etc., is also key. And also beware of the obvious or easy answer. There is a significant amount of technical debt in an OT environment, and many people search for the easy button, but it doesn't exist. I've been in this long enough to have seen this 2 different comings of the so-called silver bullet, and neither has lived up to the hype. The reality is we need to dig in, we need to know what we're dealing with, we need to address it head on. So I'm going to dig deeper into these, and if you did want to read more about that particular article, there it is for you as well. So for context, why is this such a big deal? You heard the GDP reference, that's how big cybercrime is. You heard that there's convergence of IT and OT, but it gets further compounded by the number of interested parties and the perspectives that they bring. We call it the air raid, in keeping with the Air Force and the plane sort of motif. Obviously attackers, you heard the GDP reference. More and more people are coming for operational environments because there's a lot of money and revenue tied up in the safe operation of these environments, and there's a significant downfall when they fail. Everybody on this call that's tied with OT knows what an hour of downtime costs. One of my pipeline clients recently outsourced some frontline support, and they didn't have a proper inventory, and so somebody rebooted the wrong switch, and they had to take a $13 million pipeline outage. So whether that's intentional from an attacker coming at you or unintentional internally, there's big consequences in this space, and so it becomes everyone's number one topic. The second challenge is IT. I have nothing against IT. I'm classically trained in IT. I used to run the IT department at Matricon. But the challenge is that IT is a completely different environment. IT is homogenous. Everything can be Windows 11. You patch on Tuesday. You can automate activities. If something breaks, you just come back up, and they have SLAs. Well, in the OT space, there's multiple differences, and I've got a couple slides on it, but the two biggest are that, well, we've got this whole third class of assets that are embedded devices that don't behave like Windows devices. We've got legacy equipment, not everything Windows 11, and we can't always patch on Tuesday. So there's significant differences in what you can or can't do from an IT perspective, but it doesn't mean we want to dismiss them. When I talked earlier about different teams and perspectives, we want that security knowledge. We just need to temper it into an OT environment. So I just saw a notice in the chat that I'm speaking a little fast. I will try to slow down a little bit. Thank you for the feedback. Regulation. More and more organizations in different geographies are getting regulated. We have multiple regulations already coming in North America, or already in place in North America. We've got some coming in Europe. I'm hearing about more and more in the Middle East. And so it is important to understand that we not only need to get in front of this, we need to be able to demonstrate it as well. Everyone has resource constraints. Not everybody can hire an army or have the budget for it. And even if you did, you wouldn't be able to find it. The last time I looked at the cybersecurity job seeking database, I think there was 1 million unfulfilled security jobs that are posted but people can't find, which leads to an increase in access. More and more organizations facing a resource constraint are starting to outsource, and that outsource means remote people in your environment. Do we have controls over when they're in, who's in, what they're like, what they're doing, etc.? We are seeing in North America and Europe a large push on insurance. Insurance is increasing in premiums and decreasing in coverage, and it is tied to your understanding of the OT environment. And finally, directors, high-level senior people in organizations not wanting to be a headline and wanting to know, are we doing our due diligence? Are we bringing the appropriate information? And so there's this huge impetus from multiple sites on people like ourselves that are trying to solve these challenges. The implications of this are that we are now turning more and more towards audit and assessment, managing the actual OT systems themselves, compliance and connectivity strategies, intelligent influence, in other words, appropriate and contextual understanding of the topic and the challenge, and board level involvement, all of which leads to increased labor, more activities, and more reporting. So the job is just going to get harder, and the details are going to be increased. And so if we can be proactive in how we collect, then we'll be much better positioned to be able to respond. And this is, of course, in the backdrop of OT. And I talked about it a bit earlier, but legacy equipment often does not support modern IT security tools. We still see Windows XP and Server 2003, and many, many modern technical tools don't support systems that old. And so if you're looking to the market in general, you may have a challenge with typical IT tools. Another challenge with IT approaches is that scan-based tools and cloud-based updates are often the de facto method, both of which cause serious issues in an OT environment. In fact, in North America, the entire power industry is currently unable to use cloud-based resources due to regulatory requirements. There are some that are pushing the envelope to sort of jump through the hoops and prove that it's safe. But usually in OT, cloud-based is a challenge, and certainly scan-based can cause disruptions. And then the final one is, even when we do understand what we're doing over here and want to take action on the devices, we can actually cause bigger problems. We can't do automated types of deployments necessarily. We can do some automation, some levels of automation. I'll talk about that a little bit. But there are some very serious constraints on what is typically automated response in the OT space. And then when you sort of look at the actual environment, assets, 70% are not even Windows devices, which is what most typical tools are geared towards. The average age of an OT device is much longer than the usual refresh in an IT space. And the complexity of all the different vendors and components in there, including the fact that security was never built into many of these products, is a really big deal. So that backdrop then is what causes this type of decision tree. The reference got cut off on here. I can give it to anybody who wants it, but it is from the ISA 99. The ISA 99 is the working group that then submits to IEC 62443 standards. The working group built what this is called the patch decision tree. And this is very, very typical of what an OT environment typically goes through. You can see here that we want to identify vulnerabilities because that's our risk. And once we identify them, though, we immediately ask, does it affect our industrial control system? If the answer is no, we typically just go back to work. If it does affect it, but there is a workaround, we'll often, again, go back to work. But the reality is, to be able to answer these questions or to decide what to do, we need to analyze the risk. And this is where many people start to struggle. Because to truly understand the risk to an asset, and this is where we start to build the case for contextual risk analysis, we need to understand the asset in question, the vulnerability footprint, what the impact of it is, what exposure we have internally, how far and wide is it deployed, how easy is it to fix or how easy is it to exploit, and what type of asset is on it. We have a client that looked at a vulnerability output, and at one single facility, they had 23,917 vulnerabilities. It's not an exaggeration. It's not a very big, complex environment. It is a single midstream gas processing facility. They had 23,000 vulnerabilities. Now, this is not unusual, but it is not very valuable either. You're never going to get the 23,000 down to zero. Let's be honest, we're never going to have zero risk in OT. But you're also not simply going to start from the top of the list. That may not be your most important thing. And so I'm going to walk through a little bit about where we do want to start, and this is why we need to build context. So how do we build context? I'm going to show you how we typically build the view to the clients for context, and then what the result is. We advocate that you go to the endpoint, go to the source, okay? In reference to the easy button, a lot of people want to look at secondary tool sets, or they want to look at secondary data streams, like the Rockwell Asset Center, which is a maintenance tool, which you have invested in and does contain some of the data. But it doesn't contain non-Rockwell assets. They want to look at traffic capture, which can tell you when an attack is happening or behavior changes. And by default, they can pick up some of the inventory components. But again, not going to the source means you're going to miss assets and you're going to miss information about the assets. That's why we advocate going directly to the source. All three classes of assets, your OS-based, your networking components, and your critical PLCs, relays, controllers, etc. We take those data sources and we regularly pull them offline from operations into a DMZ level database. This is where the magic begins. Once we have a detailed endpoint focused inventory, we recommend you add tribal knowledge or metadata tags to the asset records. This would include as many records as you want, but we recommend you at least include the impact of the specific asset. Let's be honest, not every OS in this environment is critical to operations. We probably have redundant domain controllers or file servers that are somewhat important, but we can live without. The converse is also true. We will have critical HMIs and safety systems that we simply cannot run without. Now, in that case, we want to annotate that on those devices so that when we're looking at a risk, we can now decide to accelerate analysis and remediation or pause, but we're starting to build for ourselves the option to have an intelligent discussion, not just a data-driven statistic. Okay, so first from the endpoint, second from the operator knowledge. And we also recommend that you include things like the physical location. Sometimes these facilities are large and complex with multiple buildings. Knowing that I've got a particular device on the third floor of a particular building in a particular rack room helps if we're trying to do, urgent response or even just day-to-day maintenance. So this layer of data tags can be asset impact, asset owner, contact information if we need it, physical and logical location, any other information we want to grab about that asset. That's the second layer of data in building context. The third layer of data is, of course, the most traditional source. We want to then bring in and overlay vulnerabilities, exploits, and available patches. So now we're starting to build 3 more dimensions of external data mapped directly to these assets and then filtered by asset criticality, function, location, whatever. You can see we're starting to build a multi-dimensional model. Now, the fourth source of data we recommend you grab is your defense in depth or layers of additional protection. This includes going east and west in the DMZ here to your antivirus, your whitelisting, and your backup investments, right? So if we can see that a particular asset is critical according to our operational team and has critical vulnerabilities associated with it, as well as exploits known to be in the wild for it, and it recently failed its most recent backup run, and whitelisting is not in lockdown, that shoots to the top of my list in those 23,000 vulnerabilities. A single indicator of risk, i.e. the backup failed, vulnerabilities critical, whitelistings disabled, are all interesting, but it doesn't paint the true picture. And then you can, of course, cascade multiple sites to a single view, a read-only view, and we're going to get back to this in a bit on the maintenance side and the scarce resources. But the real magic is in building that 3-dimensional view of the asset. Take as much information as you have available to you and bring it all together, because then you're dealing from a position of power and knowledge as opposed to just raw data. So I just walked through this, but you see how they're nested, and it all depends on whether or not you get this first part right. If you do not go to the endpoint and understand your true list of assets and what's truly on them, everything after that gets weaker and weaker because you have a weakened start point and the mistakes or the oversights compound as you move through it. So once we're done, we can apply math, simple math, but an empirical way of measuring the data that we've just collected. And so many clients are having this benefit now where they've built an internal organization, and this goes back to all the different interested parties. Maybe it's a regulatory requirement, maybe it's the board, maybe it's an insurer. We can use those inputs and those preferences to help us to develop thresholds. And the threshold is tied to a behavior. So if we have a device that's considered critical risk and it's in this threshold, we may decide that it needs to be rectified within 24 hours, if at all possible. If it's in a high threshold, we could decide that it needs to be done in 3 business days. Medium, you've got 30 days, and low is next turnaround or next outage, what have you. But we can build the behavior we want to see that matches to all the needs in the reporting and the regulatory. And then we go back to the assets and we calculate their scores to see where they land. So what we do is we take all those different indicators I just spelled out for you, and we add points to them. So every critical vulnerability, for example, present on a particular system would give you 5 points. Every time that system is considered a critical or a safety system, that adds 10 points. If it's a redundant system, maybe it only adds 2. If we see that the backup failed, another 5 points. If we see that it's not a hardened system and system configuration has been applied to it, we can add more points, and then we can calculate based on the presence or absence of these indicators to come up with a score for each and every asset that is automatically calculated and categorized into these thresholds. Now, when we decide to attack those problems and rerun the backup or apply patches, that score will then update and that device will drop to a different threshold. This is really the only way to take the vast amount of technical debt that exists in OT today and to build a contextual priority and be able to say we are truly addressing the biggest risk to this org, and we're going as far as the organization expects us to in terms of risk tolerance. Without a multidimensional and calculated view, it becomes very difficult to have an informed discussion. Moving forward, I want to show you a little bit about how that looks. So here's some examples. When you get that mapping of vulnerabilities in patch and exploit data, you can then have different views to have those discussions. We see clients have found the most benefit in 2 or 3 different views rather than a raw list. And I'm just going to walk through them. This middle piece here is vulnerabilities on specific assets. And you can see some are very bad and have high numbers. In one case, this was a client that accepted risk on these devices because they were about to go into outage, and these devices were going to be retired. And so they were able to decide from a risk tolerance perspective that they had multiple vulnerabilities indeed, but the names of the devices and the locations of them allowed them to make an informed decision to accept a risk for a few more days until they went into outage, and these were permanently retired. You could also, if they weren't to be retired, see that you had legacy equipment that just can't be patched and probably needs a capital project, or things like microsegmentation or different control access and other security practices applied to it. But by extracting the individual assets, you get a much better view exactly of where you should start. Now, another client found this chart to be even more valuable. You can't really read the words, but I will walk you through it. This is, when a vulnerability is published, the impact of the vulnerability. And as you know, they measure the impact as either attacking the availability of the system, the confidentiality of the system, or the integrity of the system. Well, in OT, availability is king. And so we could filter on a complete loss of availability here if we want, and filter this raw list down to a subset. Others want to look at the attack vector. And so here we're mapping that the vulnerability is coming from a network perspective, from a local perspective, a physical attack. And again, you can filter these out. If it's only physical-based attacks, and we know we have very good controls, physical controls at our facility, maybe we ignore those. But we can do so with the knowledge of exactly what the risk is and the assets in question. But the most powerful one here is this heat map. On the y-axis is those user-defined tags of asset criticality. And so the bottom here is critical, high, medium, and low. And on the other side, we have the criticality of the published vulnerability. And you can see here that the critical asset and the critical vulnerability have their own portion of the heat map. And it's green because the legend says if we have under 20 or 30, sort of, I think the threshold here is 30, we're okay. We're not crazy about it, but we don't have to act immediately. And so as a group, we can decide to focus down in on this critical vulnerabilities and critical assets, or we can go to this one that is high impact assets and high vulnerabilities and know that it has the highest volume for us to go and attack. So again, multiple ways to take that context and turn it into priority and eventually into action. Another way of looking at it, going a step down, because again, in OT, that whole patch decision tree not only helps us figure out what order to do things in, we invariably have to have a plan B or a C or a plan D, because the immediate need to patch or the immediate desire to patch isn't always available to us. Indeed, one of our mining clients just the other day were told by their OEM manufacturer that the latest patch just wasn't supported. And so they took, with their IT team, who understood risk and the notice from the patch and the vulnerability update, that it was really just an adjustment to 2 registry settings on about 4 devices. So they went from an unknown sort of bulletin and a challenging issue to not have the patch to a very concise and precise need. We're able to address the risk with a plan B, and that is to change the registry settings as opposed to apply the patch. They, of course, did it in a staged manner, tested it on a redundant system, etc. But when you do get to the patch level, we also want to look at when they were released by, which are the most outstanding devices, again, legacy equipment maybe that can't be patched, Maybe we want to filter based on the type of patch. Is it actually a security update or just a product update? Maybe we want to look at the patch that has the most CVEs associated with it. That's what this bar graph is. So the highest number of actual vulnerabilities are covered by this particular patch, and it applies to a number of assets. This may be the first place to start. Or over here, we can take the full patch list and sub-filter it to just that which is approved by a particular vendor on a particular date. So again, we always say, I know I don't patch, but I can't sometimes, right? And so if we're able to take the raw list and then work with the OEM vendor team at a particular site and say, okay, well, so the total list is not a possibility, but look at these bulletins and sub lists of approved by your vendor. They're still not done. Can we help you with them? And again, we turn from hyperbole to detailed discussions based on data. Now, the third line of defense we often see is what you're seeing here, and that is proactively now going to harden systems. There are no shortage of standards on the market in various places that recommend best practices for computing in general, but you need to make sure you tune it to OT. And so what we're doing here is we're immediately measuring the endpoints against OT safe system hardening practices. And so this is how we start to build that proactivity and that least privilege or system hardening component into and beyond just the front line of vulnerability and patching. So when we want to go the next step, we can also take this context, and what you're seeing here is an end of life dashboard. One of the things that we're going to find as we go through vulnerabilities and risk, and again, another aspect of context is, yes, there's risk on these devices, but they're no longer supported. So we have a choice. We live with that risk, we update the device, or we do some sort of compensating control, understanding exactly how many of them you have and where they are and what their impact is to your operations allows you, again, to not only plan and have a contextual discussion, but it also gives you a much better ability to do your capital planning, your life cycle update, and your general awareness of what risk we have, but what risk can we not address because we simply are technically constrained. So if that's all the data that we can get and we can analyze and pivot into it, now we want to look at risk reduction. I've got a couple of case studies. You see, I've got one here that says Kaspersky. I'll talk through that one in a minute. But when I talked earlier, right, about having multiple teams, and I talked about don't go to the easy answer, this is where that type of approach comes together and leverages those. We call it think global and act local. And what it means is that with this type of approach to automated data collection and context means we can then have a small team of usually very scarce resources that can leverage across multiple facilities. It is better use of those skill sets. It is a more efficient response, and it allows for the organization to save significant time and money because this small team is now able to see a new risk and how it pertains to every single facility in one view. They then can craft a response once and share it multiple times. This is a huge efficiency gain, and when you can introduce automated actions under certain circumstances with OT oversight, you gain significant traction. And that's what this case study is about. So I'm just going to talk. We have a client, had 6 different coal-fired facilities, and were asked to remove Kaspersky. It was a corporate directive in a US-based company to not have this particular piece of software. And the central team was able to see the software list for each of those sites, what software was installed on which system, and they filtered for Kaspersky. They then used the technology to say, I would like to uninstall Kaspersky, but they stopped short of actually doing it because in OT, we want to be careful. We don't want to big brother push, right? We're using different skill sets. So we set a flag on the command that said, make it an offer. And then we sent, because we had a detailed list of each asset at each site and where it was physically, in which building, in which floor of which room. Each of those technicians at each of the sites were able to do this in parallel and go directly to the system tray of the device when they got there and they saw the request to remove the software. They phoned their operator in their control room. They followed their change control. They followed their testing and verification for the system coming back online. But all 6 sites had the task queued up for them and detailed on a punch list. They were able to do it in parallel in under 2 hours. That is light years faster than most organizations. In fact, I'm going to go into a deeper case study here for you on this one. We have a large operating company with thousands of miles of assets, typically your pipeline or your transmission and distribution. They have a distributed team geographically. I mean, this pipeline runs from Alaska down to Florida. And so very different people in very different areas, often subcontractors in certain regions, thousands of assets, varying OS types, devices, Linux, Unix, Windows, etc., all sorts of networking gear, and the assets were spread out across hundreds of physical sites. I was consulting with this organization when something like Bluekeep came along. And what happened here, this is before the technology was deployed and this sort of think global architecture was set up. Dozens of people in spreadsheets were called and summoned to the first meeting when this vulnerability was first released. There were multiple follow-on meetings and set up recurring meetings. There wasn't really a concrete understanding of scope. Now, this client was particularly behind the 8 ball. They often had to log into servers and check the start and run programs to see what software was on it, and then guess that that was a particular device for a particular department because of the software running on it. So it wasn't an ideal starting point. They had no real understanding of the system criticality or the vintage or where it was, and they started a manual patching process and manual tracking. The total effort was 6 full-time people diverted from their engineering jobs and over 10 weeks to complete. They eventually got to about 90% coverage. It took about 2,500 hours, man-hours, staff hours. Not an ideal environment. With a view across all of their assets, once they had deployed a think global, act local approach, they had a central team with a 360-degree view of the assets, an accurate list of devices in scope, and at the kickoff meeting, it was a very small set of personnel, and they started to actively act on the risk. They knew that this particular attack was targeting remote desktop and via the guest account. And so what they did was they started to do some proactive hardening of the system while they worked on doing the patching. The patch team could then identify redundant systems that were safe to test a patch on, and they could bake in a 2012 patch test, for example, and then share that with a wider audience. And as they cascaded through the different types, they became more and more successively automated. And then they dispatched local technicians to unstationed or unmanned facilities to oversee patch process. In total, this was run by half of the staff, and it took a fraction of the time to take to get it done. In fact, we've seen clients estimate a 70% reduction in effort in this sort of approach, which when you're talking about scarce resources, very precise details, and a complex environment, that's a significant move towards a more mature model. Last couple of slides and we'll switch to some Q&A. We got about 20 minutes left. We'll leave about 15 for Q&A. Beware of the obvious or easy answer. Again, just to bring it back, this is the third of the 3 components that initial discussion had brought up. Data is just data, so we built context, and multiple teams are required to be able to pull these off with the right information. And finally, don't try to hit the easy route. I showed you earlier in the cascading data that if we don't have the information to start with, we will be back at the data gathering at some point in time, or we will be making guesses. You're never going to get to 0. And so you need to pivot to what you need to do. And that example of the 23,900 or so vulnerabilities, we can't get that to 0, but we need to know where the critical risk resides on the critical assets, and act on those first, and then cascade down to other sets. The endpoint is the only place to get the data. We recently had a client come to us and say, could you use that central aggregation database where you build the magical dimensional stuff And instead of going to the endpoint, could you go to our WSS database and go to our Rockwell Asset Center and go to our Maximo database? You can, but you're going to miss stuff and you're going to make mistakes and you're going to have duplication and you're going to have potentially confusion. And sounds like a really sort of pieced together solution. We can't be afraid of the endpoint. It is where the data resides. If you don't want to believe me, well, we've been doing this for 15 years, never caused an outage or had a avoided warranty. We're running on 150,000 endpoints in 1,100 facilities in 85 countries worldwide. That's a pretty good proof point. This is not something that's radical. This is not something that's dangerous, but it certainly is something that's very, very powerful and beneficial. And so go to the endpoint and then incorporate as many other components about the asset as you can. One of the things I didn't show in the risk building is the newest release of this analysis and calculation, which includes the exploit probability score. There is a nonprofit group that's tracking not only that there is exploits related to vulnerabilities, but how many exploits have been successful. And so the more successful ones or the more impactful ones, or maybe the ones you want to worry about first, again, a further filter within there. And so anytime we can get new aspects about where to focus or where not to, we want to continue to add to that view. So summary, data without context really isn't much use. A huge vulnerability list or a huge list of components that we don't have context for is a risk. Cross-functional teams allow for collaboration, but also execution. The example of the patch not being approved by the vendor, but IT helping us to decide what we can or can't do and how to do it, and then OT deciding, is it safe to do that? It's almost like IT is going to help you figure out the risk and the options, and then from the options, OT gets to pick what's the safest to OT and how they would deploy it. That's the best convergence, if you will, of those two organizations. And it goes back to the second point, multiple teams and diverse teams are key components to this. Don't take the easy path. Like I said, listening, tangential, you miss things. We have a client that they put the technology on the endpoint and they found 47 dormant administrative accounts that belonged to employees who no longer worked for the company. Those are not active accounts on a wire or in packets or logging into a domain controller, but it is an administrative level access point for any sort of virus or malicious software in that environment. So it may not be immediately apparent to you, but it is a hidden or a lurking risk that you need to be aware of. And again, the way to do that is to go to the endpoint. Automate where you can, verify the data you're looking at, again, from multiple cross-references and points of view, and then plan to maintain. The single biggest error that I've seen in 20 years of doing this is anybody can buy a tool set. Anybody can write a policy or a procedure. Anyone can put the title of OT on your security badge or your business card. If you don't have a plan to keep this up to date, you will fall behind again. It is actually a much more dynamic environment than we think, and the risk continually and perpetually evolves. That's all I had for today. We can go ahead and turn to Q&A. For anybody who wants to follow up with me, there is my email and my phone number, as well as the company I work for. And so I'd be happy now to throw it to my host, my MC, to maybe field a few questions. I've seen a few in the chat, but I'll let you be the MC of what we're tackling first here, Julia. You're muted, unfortunately. Great. There you go.
Okay, great. Thanks, Rick. I want to remind everyone again, if you would like to propose a question, we please ask that you post it in the Q&A tool, and we'll get started with the Q&A and field as many of your questions as possible. I know one of the repeated questions that have been posted already is, will the presentation be available after the session? So if you can let us know, Rick, if that will be the case, and then we will see how we share that with the attendees.
I'm of course happy to share it. If IoT has a formal process to post it somewhere and get it to them, that's fine. We can also share it if they don't want. We're always happy to share. We aim to educate.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to start with we have lots of questions actually, so we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So one question coming from the audience is, how does scanning endpoints cause disruption?
Great question. So typical vulnerability scanning is in an OT environment. If you use them to the full power, it's a pretty invasive scan on OS-based devices. It can consume a lot of resources. If you have older legacy equipment and you take the resources away from operations, that can be a challenge. So most scan-based in OT are either only fully executed on fairly robust things like domain controllers and file servers, or they scale down the intensity and the frequency, or they will only do of a primary, a redundant pair. They'll maybe do the backup or the offline version, and then they'll switch control to the other. So it becomes a very manual process. And when you extend to PLCs and relays, almost all vulnerability tools are not able to scan those without causing them to be pretty significantly disrupted.
Great. Thank you, Rick. And so actually there were several questions in here, and now I've lost visibility to some of them. So for some reason, they're not in my Q&A box. So I'm going to ask a question that I have. With more regulations and also directives on the horizon, and all the different choices and options that you have in terms of tools and services or service providers that may help with your cybersecurity, how do you know if you're applying the right framework to optimize your cybersecurity efforts?
The right framework, so a guideline. I like that, because we always talk about understanding before you start. What does done look like? Like, how do we know when we're done? And that goes back to a framework. Now, to be honest, I don't think anyone is perfect. I think that you probably should take an approach with something as a start or a framework, unless, of course, you're regulated, in which you don't have a choice. But I would recommend you take what makes sense and you maybe adjust it a little bit for your environment. So we advocate that people start loosely with the NIST CSF, for example. But if you want to get granular, you can borrow from another standard like CIS 18, which has maturity levels within the practices. So for example, I want to have a hardware inventory and I want to achieve a maturity level of 2 that has certain characteristics about that inventory to achieve that maturity of 2. And then the next time you can come back and maybe aspire to a level of 3, which is more automation and verification, et cetera. So my response would be that the guideline, again, unless it's prescribed to you in a regulated environment, the guidelines and the framework should be taken and adapted to what is practical to your organization. If we set the bar too high and we're a really old legacy environment, we're going to have exceptions all over the place and not achieve any of it. So you want to be reasonable and do a scaled approach. We typically, when we do an assessment against a standard, we purposely put remediation actions in 3 buckets that are related to maturity as you evolve. The first is low-hanging fruit. Dormant admin accounts, like I mentioned in the speech, or multiple team viewer installations that are providing people bypassed remote access points. The middle layer are a little bit more mature, which would be things like network segmentation projects or a formal remote access process. And the futuristic ones would be capital projects, so upgrading legacy equipment or re-architecting process, et cetera. So the short answer to which is the best guideline is the guideline has to fit your needs as an organization. It has to have a measure back to your current maturity and how ambitious you're trying to be. And it has to be something that is agreed by multiple parties as well within the organization.
Great. So the next question is there any inclusion of open cybersecurity alliance standards to make the integrations with various systems swift and seamless?
I'm not as familiar with the open security standards, other than I know that the general body of knowledge is trying to not have so many proprietary things and use common protocols. As those come on board, like the SIP protocol, for example, the Common Industrial Protocol, it significantly benefits our development effort and our ability to get more data from more systems. So absolutely, I encourage them. How far and wide they've been deployed and adopted, though, is something we can always improve upon.
Then the next question, does Verve scan existing environments and provide quick and top recommendations to SecureOTs?
So we do have what we call a tech-enabled assessment where we do use the technology. It's not like a portable tool that we come in and go out. We could certainly do something like that, but if you want to talk deeper, I'd be happy to take that offline from the wider group discussion.
And is it possible with the tool to begin with asset discovery with the option to turn on active threat detection at a later stage for sites that may not currently have the capabilities or people available to actively monitor or handle threats?
Yes.
And that's actually a good question, because I was reading in a Gartner report as well that there is a continuing shortage of cybersecurity resources in terms of people resources and skill sets, people with those skill sets. So that's a very good question. Also,
well, and to be honest,
sorry.
if I just may jump in, Julia, that's exactly why we built this the way we did, is that corporate view that minimizes the needs allows for either you to help that site, to sort of spoon feed what they need, or for you to get your favorite trusted managed service or outsourced provider to then see, and you can collectively look at exactly where the risk is and how we want to do what we can do without requiring a huge amount of people. And it may be in-house, it may be external, it can also be staged, right? We can see that of the 5-alarm fire, there's only one really big deal we need to worry about. And so now we're making those decisions to not have to react or do things, but based again on our true understanding of the risk by site, by location, et cetera.
So another question, there's a participant that's currently interested in OT cybersecurity, and they would like recommendations regarding where to start in terms of educational courses and certifications. Yeah,
so more and more organizations are offering training. OT cyber is I joke, it's IT cyber with one hand tied behind your back because of the challenges of OT. So really, it's a dual sort of understanding of getting into maybe the automation industry, working with one of the automation vendors or many distributors and resellers of the large OEMs do have job postings for security type of roles that come in and take that security background. From a security perspective, you could look at online courses. You could look at some of the established institutes like SANS or CISSP type of things. But to me, the more practical route would be, actually taking security specific training courses where we prefer Google or, your local college, and then working at a distributor or systems integrator OT type of environment, because it's really two different skill sets that need to come together.
Exactly. That's a great point. Does Verve take into account behavioral analysis at endpoints?
Yeah, so Verve is an endpoint management tool, and in the world of intrusion detection, if you will, just kind of where that question's going, there's two schools of thought. There is the network-based approach, which is the traffic that we're seeing, and tools like Clarity and Nozomi and whatnot are fantastic at it. They're there to listen to the traffic, they're there to analyze it, they're there to tell you immediately if something changes. But the true security practitioners are going to say, that's great, I can see the interaction between two systems, but what's missing for me is what's happening on the systems. And that's why we've actually developed an endpoint-based system collection of event logs, syslog, netflow, things like CPU and memory spike, et cetera. So if we see from a network perspective that system A is attacking system B, we can then be resident on both A and B and see what's actually happening. So we see the initial attack from A to B, but then while we're on B, we can see that attack resulted in a privilege escalation of the guest account and the creation of a network share and a collection of certain files, et cetera. So yes, we very much advocate a host-based anomaly detection and monitoring to add to a network-based or perimeter-based as well.
Are your scans automated based on vendor and protocol, meaning if the tool makes sure in taking the necessary steps to not scan devices with the incorrect protocol and without having an analyst selecting each device to each proprietary query?
Yeah, good question. So it's not quite a scan based. It's the exact same query. So we set up that if we're going to talk to a Rockwell PLC, that IP address and MAC address is tied to Rockwell, and our request to that IP and MAC address is in Rockwell language. That is scheduled, that's set up, that's automated. We don't like scan that device. We're just going to connect to it and say, give me your firmware, your hardware, your serial number. So it's only a few kilobits in direction, a few kilobits back. So if it were, for some reason, that IP was now no longer a Rockwell PLC, but somebody put a Beckwith or Bentley Nevada in there, it would simply drop the packet because it doesn't understand the protocol. So it's not a scan-based thing that would be problematic, but yes, it is set up very precisely.
And how does the push for supply chain openness affect IIoT risk management?
Push for supply chain openness. Well, what we're seeing is that we're getting a much higher level of scrutiny when we start to engage with a new client. We need to show what our own software development lifecycle looks like, what our QA looks like, and more we're being asked to put a software bill of materials together as well. So that because we realize we're a key component of the supply chain. And so we proactively continue to evolve pen testing of our software, pen testing of the components, analysis of our own code for vulnerabilities. It's a prerequisite to being in this industry and providing a software platform.
Then is there any compulsory compliance to be followed for land-based solution when we wanted to say cyber secure solution?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Could you say it again? Is there a compulsory
compliance to be followed for land-based solution when we wanted to say cyber secure solution?
I'm not sure I fully follow, but I do know that there are compliance requirements. We talk about land-based. There's a growing push in multiple geographies for data to not be either in the cloud, or if it is, it has to be resident in the country in which it was generated and stored. So there are some compliance requirements around data storage, retention, access, etc. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but there are growing needs in that space.
And then maybe a quick, one more quick question, and then we have to move on to the next session. Are there demos available?
Yes, just grab my contact info. I'd be happy to do a demo for somebody. I do see one last one. I know we need to wrap, Julia, but the question about some of our clients are in manufacturing, machines using legacy OS, the oldest is XP. This is exactly why we advocate this type of approach. Verve, by the way, is able to support XP in Server 2003. And the idea is you can't patch. You can't go with plan A. You are by default on plan B, C, and D, like we talked about in the demo. And the only way to understand that is to have that contextual risk. So 100%, we would want to work with you to identify those XP, take the patching option off the plate, and now what can we do for that system configuration, system hardening, making sure the antivirus, the backup, maybe microsegmentation are all in place. Those are all what you'd need to do in that exact scenario.
Great. We are now at the end of the time for the session today. So I want to recognize Verve again for their sponsorship. Also, thank you, Rick, for your great insight you have provided for the organizations to adopt an integrated security approach beyond legacy OT. For those of you attending the session today, we appreciate your participation and also some of the great questions that were provided to Rick. We hope you'll join us as we move to the next session that we're presenting regarding best practices to protect your industrial system. And that session is sponsored by TX1 Networks and RMC. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.